I'd like to say at the outset of this video that I chose the title consciously, but I want to, before I proceed with the video, offer some caveats. I'm not a huge fan of the blue-red pill dichotomy these days. In fact, I have not been for several years. That said, blue pill, red pill, they are descriptive terms. It's just that the specificity that we formally attach to blue pill, red pill has been essentially lost over time. It can mean all sorts of things. It's become almost cheesy, a bit cliche. But because it still has descriptive power and it does convey something, I decided to use it for the title. So just a clarification there. But essentially what I want to do in this video is answer some questions and some queries that I've gotten for years now in different forums. And these many different forums of this one question amount to, why are so many men still blue-pilled? Now you'd think that would be an easy question to answer. I don't believe it is, because there's a degree of complexity behind that. First off, what do we mean by blue pill? You can be red pill and still pursue certain things, even marriage. But by blue pill, what these guys mean, and what I mean, is simply ignorant about fundamental differences between men and women, different reproductive strategies, not paying attention to women's behavior, something I'll come to later, etc., etc. So there are a number of issues here. Some carry greater weight and importance than others, but let me start with the more minor issues, because that seems more appropriate. One of the simplest reasons why so many men are blue-pilled or ignorant of certain things is because the quote-unquote red pill community is a tiny minority if you think about the big picture, a fraction of a greater fraction. Most people are quote-unquote normies. Most people, men and women, are just going about their lives, doing things as they always would have, albeit with a bit more technology at their disposal. They're not plumbing the depths of the internet looking for arcane knowledge. And so whatever reach and scope we think red pill ideas might have, and again, I'm using this term very broadly, but in the context of the manosphere sense of the red pill, it's not the scope a lot of people in the manosphere presume it to have. Most people are just wholly ignorant of these things. So one of the first problems when we talk about quote-unquote blue-pilled men is just reach. A lot of these ideas, whether they're correct or not, and that's a separate issue, are just not reaching them because they're not looking for them. They have quote-unquote normal lives. Now, when we come to some of the trickier issues, it's not quite as black and white. Because I think a lot of men, particularly in the MGTOW circles, underestimate the power of reproductive drives, feelings, emotions, and the pull behind that. So what do I mean by that? Now this isn't a perfect analogy, but you have to imagine that for many men, being quote-unquote red-pilled or accepting certain revelations is akin to a traumatic religious deconversion. Imagine if you had been raised in some sort of religious cult and all of a sudden everything you had come to believe has turned out to be not true or unlikely to be true. And the very foundations of your world, as a consequence, lie shattered in ruins. So you're going to get a lot of resistance to any idea that challenges a fundamental worldview of yours if that worldview helps shape the integrity of your ego, your well-being, your personality. For instance, even accepting that women can be quote-unquote difficult, that it's not as easy as just being a good guy and going out there and doing your best, that itself is a difficult proposition for a lot of men to accept. Add to that the many, many layers of theory and the nitty-gritty of all the interactions that go well beyond what a blue pill man might come to expect. It's a lot to take in. And some guys are just going to resist it until their dying day. And even when they see these things, you see these stories, of course, of men who've been married twice, 3 times, 4 times, 5, just one after the other. And it also is encapsulated in a dependency. I'll never forget an older gentleman I used to know that I sometimes trained with years ago. I was in my mid-20s. He was in his 40s at the time. And I was trying to explain to him that even though I was blue-pilled at the time, of course, I couldn't really fathom why he always needed some form of a girlfriend. And he would just say something to the effect of, and I'm paraphrasing, I just need somebody there. So in some sense, the emotional, psychological dependency on female company is so immense, it might be likened to something like food and water. But I think that we in the manosphere, and specifically in MGTOW circles, tend to underestimate the weight, the pull, the gravity of reproductive drives. It's essentially, after food and water, the next strongest thing. Men, typically speaking, are drawn to women like moths are drawn to flame, and all the mechanisms involved in interacting and the dynamism and the complexities, these are all secondary or tertiary in some cases. So in a sense, a lot of that gets bypassed. What I said earlier is that men are just not paying attention. So coming back to a point I alluded to earlier, men are just not paying attention really, because it's hard to pay attention to these details. Think about all the things we do just on the level of instinct. We're hungry, so we eat. I mean, one of the reasons why we have an obesity epidemic, there are many reasons, is that we evolved to just eat things that are hyper-palatable and calorically dense if possible, and boom, that's what we have these days. So on the one hand, you have this issue with information simply not getting out there. And on the other hand, you have this more complex issue of, frankly speaking, men not wanting to come to terms with certain things. For example, how difficult women can be, and that's putting it mildly, because it runs counter to their instincts and flies in the face of what they actually want to be the case. It's a question of reality versus fantasy. Many, many men prefer to live and dwell in the fantasy. And if you had any doubts about this, just see how men act. We've all seen how gaga men can act simply for the sake of a woman. They cast their friends aside, they lose all social contact, they become obsessed. These are considered normal behaviors, mind you. And challenging that with quote-unquote red pill knowledge or red pills is a monumental task. See, I'm rather convinced after a long time that this expression, taking the red pill, is not appropriate. Men come to this red pill state of knowledge after a great deal of time has passed. And it's a gradual thing. They need to want to seek it out. The old adage of bringing a horse to water but being unable to make him drink comes to mind. And I think about my own red pill journey. I had been highly suspicious of male-female relationships for probably the better part of a decade before I finally, quote-unquote, took the red pill. But there was a previous state. Some people call it purple pill, whatever. I was noticing things. A lot of these guys never notice any of this stuff. A lot of these guys never question their instincts. They never question whether or not this is good or wholesome. And so you have a lack of motivation, you have that information not getting out there, is not going to receive that information, and you have that really, really powerful instinct that runs counter to that. Everything in a man's body is telling him that women are quote-unquote universally good. Spending time with them is good, listening to them is good, their actions are good, etc., etc. You actually have to pay attention to the details to pick up on the reality that maybe women are not sugar and spice and all things nice. And maybe there are problems with women. And on a final note, many, many men are just desperate to reproduce. Most organisms have this. Most organisms want to replicate their DNA. Human beings are no exception here. And I've seen this many, many times. I know people on a personal level who, despite all the red pill knowledge they've absorbed over the years, are still going to bite the bullet and get married and have children because they just feel this urge. and for whatever reason, going their own way doesn't work for them or it's dissatisfying. The prospects of going your own way, however you want to term that or understand that, I think that's something that for most men is just not appealing fundamentally. So you combine all these factors, and it's no surprise that most men are blue-pilled. Even red-pilled men are quote-unquote blue-pilled in some sense, because they, for whatever reason, lack the capacity to try to counter their own instincts in various ways. Let's be frank, and I've said this before, going your own way is not for every man. Because most men, again, they're obsessed with reproduction, they're obsessed with female company, they feel that they need it, otherwise they're not complete, or they'll lose their minds. I've talked to these guys, that's what they'll say. So I think it's less a question of why men are blue-pilled and more a question of why are men even red-pilled to begin with. It's quite an astonishing thing if you think about it. Being aware of these things, actively striving against some of your most base and primitive instincts. That's the remarkable thing, not the fact that there are lots of blue-pill men out there. They're a dime a dozen. Anyway, I wanted to cover this topic because I've been getting this question for years. In part, I think there's this impression that everywhere you look, there's some red pill dispensary and every man is aware of these things. No. And then add to that the battery of issues I've mentioned. Well, there you go. That's the reason why so many men are blue-pilled. Anyway, enjoy the rest of your weekend. And as always, may the gods watch over you. If I'm still alive, I'll catch you later. Bye-bye.